This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. The course of the hour will run through all the business news stories you need to know about from right across the continent. But let's start with a quick run through the markets here for you. So retail and bank stocks are enjoying multi-day streaks of gains at the JSE. Today, frankly, was no different. Massmart up 1.4%, lenders like RMB not far behind. Of course, about 6 days away from the country's general elections, it's going to be very interesting to see what bearing the results there have on South African assets and not just equities at all. We'll also be talking about East Africa's most profitable listed firm in a bit. Safaricom shares are up 5.3% higher today. They close a little bit lower. Full year results coming out in the next 12 hours or so. Here's what's coming up tonight. Zambia's 2018 fiscal deficit forecast to be above 7.5% of GDP. We'll look at the outcomes of the recently wrapped up trade talks between China and the United States. And a Rwandese entrepreneur is making purely organic cosmetics. That story and plenty more is in the pipeline. But today, let's start with a bigger macro picture, if you will. The International Monetary Fund is forecasting a marginal rise in growth across Sub-Saharan Africa from the current figure of about 3.5% to an average of 4% in 2019. But it's warning that growth rate is not sufficient. It's simply not keeping pace with the current job creation requirements across the region. With the details, here's CGTN's Kelechi Emekalam.
Officials from the IMF releasing economic growth outlooks for the sub-Saharan region in Nigeria's capital, Abuja, only weeks after it held its spring meeting in the US. The bank is forecasting faster growth rates in African economies less dependent on natural resources. And there are only 21 countries out of 45 that fit in that bracket. The IMF expects growth in those countries to top 5% above the region's average of 4%, while resource-dependent countries like Nigeria and South Africa are expected to record slower growth rates as commodity prices plummet in global markets.
One challenge with this, of course, is that at 4% for the region as a whole, again, the growth rate is not high enough to create the millions and millions of jobs that need to be created in the coming years.
Nigeria and South Africa account for 2/3 of the region's total population. The IMF is urging governments in both countries to remove policies holding back productivity. It's also recommending increased public investment, improved debt management, and improvement in revenue mobilization, plus enhancing exchange rates flexibility.
7 out of 45 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa are in debt distress, needing some kind of direct efforts to address the very high levels of debt. 6 of these countries are very fragile countries. These are Republic of Congo, Eritrea, the Gambia, Sao Tome and Principe, South Sudan, and Zimbabwe. And 2 out of these 7 are oil exporters, Republic of Congo and South Sudan.
At the current growth rate, the IMF says the sub-Saharan region can only generate about 12 million jobs annually. That's far less than the number of new entrants in the job market, estimated at 20 million per year. For the region to keep pace with job demands, Sub-Saharan Africa must attain an average 6% economic growth rate by 2030. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN, Abuja, Nigeria.
Now, according to its finance ministry, Zambia's fiscal deficit in 2018 was 7.5% of GDP, but that was way higher than the government earlier projected. The earlier projection was about 7%. Zambia's finance minister, in a meeting with an IMF delegation, said the measures to keep the deficit within the 2019 budget target of 6.5% of GDP would be undertaken. But Zambia's external debt was a little over $10 billion at the end of last year, up from $9.5 billion at the end of the third quarter of the exact same year. The Southern African state's total debt as a percentage of GDP is an eye-watering 73%. Now remember, Zambia's fiscal crisis has been brewing for quite a while. So what is the latest chapter looking like? CGTN's Farai is in Harare tonight with the latest on this story. Right then, so Farai, the IMF's assessment of Zambia's fiscal health pretty dire, points to GDP growth of just 2.3% this year, rising inflation, fiscal deficits of 10% and barely 2 months of reserves. What is the plan to boost the country's fiscal reserves?
Well, indeed, Ramah, things looking a bit dire there, and certainly the Zambian government itself acknowledges that there will be a slowdown in economic growth this year on the back of some of those challenges that you've spoken about, but also a drought in certain parts of the country that has affected, many certain parts of the country. And so based on that, based on inflation, based on, some of those debt challenges, it is facing an uphill task in terms of getting the economy back on track. But Finance Minister Margaret Mwanakatwe, after meeting with the IMF, said that they have agreed that there's need to accelerate some reforms that will look at the fiscal deficit. So slowing down government's debt accumulation, cutting down on expenditure, monetary policy measures targeting inflation to ensure that it remains within the projected or budgeted 6 to 8% target. That is what the government of Zambia is planning to do. And it says that if those measures are done quite quickly, if it can stick to its guns and stick to the program that has been agreed with the IMF, then very quickly the economy can return to sustainable growth. The reserves can be bolstered. We know in the past where Zambia has faced challenges in terms of its reserves. It's looked to taxation, increasing royalties, for instance, and mining as a way to shore up its reserves. But I think given the need to balance economic growth to keep miners happy and productive, it may not do that and will look to fiscal consolidation measures in order to cut its spending and have more reserves available. Ramah.
Indeed, the IMF also did recommend that as part of efforts to reorganize its broader debt load of about $10 billion now, that Zambia needs to stop taking on any new non-concessional debt. But at this point in time, can Zambia really afford to do that?
Well, it's a tricky it's a tricky proposition, as you say. Difficult, precarious point in time now, especially facing the prospect of drought, the need to, make sure that everyone is food secure, to come up with measures that will ensure that, the economy can still grow while the people who are facing hunger and starvation are catered for and are provided for. Some of these measures that are required to stimulate the economy, to get it growing again, may need funding, and, the temptation or the quickest way to do that is obviously sometimes to borrow and access those loans. But I think there has been a commitment, not just from Treasury, but even from the President himself. I know last year he did say that, the government would be more transparent in terms of its borrowing policy, slow down borrowing and only restrict it to what is necessary because of those concerns around debt distress. So it is, it will be difficult, but I think this is something that Zambia has committed to do and certainly must do if it is to come out of this hole and ensure that it is sustainably able to grow its economy going forward and get out of some of the debt challenges it is facing. I like the term you used there, eye-watering, 73%. Certainly not sustainable. That has to come down. And those are some of the things that hopefully with the help of the IMF, Zambia is able to do.
Indeed, and of course the debt service side is equally alarming. But one last thing for you. The IMF was silent in its statement about fresh talks with Zambia on a credit line. But are the authorities in Lusaka talking to China, which is a big creditor to Zambia? Are they talking to China about restructuring what debt they do have?
Well, at this point, we've not had any confirmation from the authorities or from Treasury there in terms of what the situation is in terms of that debt with China, restructuring it, or perhaps even getting more in terms of assisting it now. But I would imagine, given the relationship that Zambia has with China, the assistance that it has already, given, that will be an option and an avenue that Zambia can pursue. But I think also given the need to ensure that debt is sustainable, to address some of the concerns that, ordinary Zambians have expressed that, we're taking on too much debt, we are being loaded with too much debt, and it will be future generations that will bear this burden and who may suffer the consequences. I think that, if there is any discussion with partners and donors and multilateral, countries such as China and institutions like that, it will certainly be with caution and certainly with consultation of all the stakeholders, because as I say, the President has said there will be more transparency in terms of debt given this this history and this legacy that Zambia has in terms of its debt challenges.
Indeed, we'll leave it there for the time being. Farai Mokutuya there in Harare, Zimbabwe. All right, then a quick run through some company news now. Let's start with Barclays in Kenya. It's set to appoint Ernst & Young as the company's new auditor. The company is effectively parting ways with KPMG Kenya, which has audited it for the last 2 years. This is part of its agenda that effectively mirrors that of its parent company, the Absa Group, which offloaded KPMG due to the corruption investigation into controversial Gupta-related entities. Further afield, Royal Dutch Shell has reported a small drop in first quarter profit. $5.4 billion is the number. This easily beat previous forecasts, though, helped by stronger trading and liquefied natural gas earnings. The firm's results did dwarf those of rivals ExxonMobil, Chevron and BP, which saw sharp declines due to lower refining margins and weaker crude and gas prices. Shell's shares were up 1.4% shortly after the start of trading. German automaker Volkswagen has shrugged off a $1.1 billion legal charge by meeting its first quarter operating profit target. That led to an increase in its share prices by over 3%. Earnings before interest and taxes fell to about $4.37 billion, down from $4.7 billion the previous year. In 2015, the company admitted to having used illegal software in order to cheat on emissions tests around the world. That resulted in a global backlash against diesel engines, and it's costing the car maker $32.5 billion so far. The multinational aerospace company Canada's Bombardier Inc. has announced it will be selling its operations in Belfast. 3,600 people are employed there. The decision is part of a plan to combine the firm's corporate and regional units into a single aviation unit and shed more non-core assets. Now, the plant has been a pillar of Belfast's economy, putting thousands of jobs right across Northern Ireland. That's a run through your company headlines. It's time for a short break. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. As we continue our special coverage ahead of the general elections in South Africa, our team there will be looking at the tourism industry. Stay tuned. Plenty coming up.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business. Only on CGTN.
On May 8th, 27 million South Africans go to the polls. Africa's most industrialized nation is just emerging from recession and still faces enormous economic challenges. Join us on Global Business Africa for a week of in-depth coverage and analysis on the state of the country's economy. A different perspective of events shaping South Africa.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Naro.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home and their relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN. And welcome to our special coverage on South Africa ahead of the upcoming May elections. Tonight we're coming to you from right at the heart of Cape Town's central business district. Well, let's get into it. Now, South Africa is the largest tourism economy in Africa. New data from the World Travel and Tourism Council shows that the industry contributed about 1.5 million jobs in 2018, generating almost $30 billion for the country's economy. Now, that figure represents about 8.6% of all economic activity in the country. Despite challenges regarding visas, ease of access for key source markets, security, and of course that recent drought, the sector still continues to thrive. Well, here's Renee Delcarme with more on South Africa's tourism sector.
During the apartheid years, overseas arrivals in South Africa were largely made up of people visiting family members in the country. But there's been steady growth in the sector over the past 25 years.
Since 1994, we've seen quite astronomical growth in tourism arrivals in South Africa, both from the African continent and from overseas markets. What we've seen in the last few years is very impressive growth from both North America and South America, and of course India and China surfacing as potentially enormous source markets for South African tourism.
About 10 million international tourists visit South African shores every year. The government has set itself a target of doubling this figure by the year 2030, but admits it's already falling short of its target. The South African tourism sector has been adversely affected by negative factors such as stringent visa requirements, which were introduced in 2015 and has since been relaxed, a notoriously high crime rate, and devastating drought conditions in the tourist mecca of Cape Town in 2018.
People were worried that Cape Town might run out of water. It wasn't going to happen, but of course many people changed their travel plans, and the consequence was that we had negative growth in international tourist arrivals in Cape Town. Similarly, perceptions of crime by any global standards for tourists and the kinds of things they do, South Africa is a safe place. Nonetheless, perceptions matter, and they have dampened tourist arrivals in our country.
South African tourism employs over 600,000 people, with a value chain of around 1.5 million people. And the government has identified it as a sector with huge potential.
Our forecast ahead is a very positive forecast, but right now, if we have to be honest, we're a bit flat right now. We're not where we thought we would have been a couple of years ago. But at the same time, we're aware of the factors, addressing the factors, and therefore we anticipate really good future growth.
And it's hoped that this growth will translate into more much-needed jobs in South Africa.
We just simply have a very beautiful, exquisitely beautiful country with a diversity of offerings. So from day one, I knew that this is something that can be sold.
Renee Delcarme, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
Now, let's look forward. Of course, South Africa has some pretty ambitious targets for its tourism sector. The government says it wants to attract about 5 million tourists in the next 5 years. President Ramaphosa also says he wants to double the number of people who are directly employed in the travel and tourism sector. Now, of course, all this requires not just infrastructure, but for the industry to adapt to the fast-changing trends in the global tourism space. Also, we have to ask the question, is the country making regional integration and issues such as environmental sustainability a priority going forward? Well, I sat down with Corny Koch. She's the head of the Convention Bureau at Westgrow, which of course specializes in promoting the Western Cape region, to find out more about these issues.
Travel trade is gearing themselves towards recognizing global trends. How do we adapt? How do we use that? And how do we also promote intercontinental travel from African, and a big focus on domestic tourism. We tend to ignore our domestic tourism market, and that's a big focus in South Africa, even for us here in the Western Cape.
Well, let's talk about some of the ways in which you're adapting. For example, about 64% of South Africa's tourism sector is leisure travel. How are you looking to expand those segments going forward?
Yes, so I think domestically that's a big push for us, focusing on niche areas in the province, specifically in our province. How do we use the core strengths of the province and attract a particular market? The youth market is for us important, and then a certain focus on wine tourism, the food and wine sector, culture and heritage, for instance. And in our case, we're also going to venture into the medical tourism space, wellness space. So that's what each of the sectors or the provinces in South Africa is doing, is what is unique to their province and how does that fit into the bigger picture of South Africa. Because we as a province, we product develop, they get themselves ready for market, and then through a provincial strategy, how we push that into the market, the South African tourism strategy is sort of aligned to that, and then there's one message that goes out.
Now, the Western Cape is sort of a starting point when it comes to innovation in South Africa's tourism sector, and then sort of the rest of the country goes along with it. Give us a sense of whether you think right now South Africa is at par with international standards when it comes to innovation in tourism, right?
The strategy is important for us in the Western Cape, so we do make sure that we take data, we investigate tourism data, and we adapt that to plans. So and we do follow that, and that's even aligned to South Africa Tourism's plan. Where's the bigger picture? Where do they lead to? How do we follow, or how do we complement each other? Good working relationship between those and the data management of that. Otherwise, we can't plan and we can't get into market and we can't measure the amount of travelers that come through.
Now, one of the trends that's picking up globally right now is the idea of short-term stay or Airbnb, and that's something that is picking up in South Africa, sort of shaking the industry. In fact, there's a new tourism amendment bill that is addressing that in particular. How do you feel about that as stakeholders in the tourism sector?
In our capacity, we welcome new entrants. Of course, there's bigger picture that takes place. There's, like you've just mentioned, the bill is there for comment. It's got good and bad reception at the moment in terms of the market. Some says leave it, it's a private sector initiative, let them be. Others say no, the regulation is important because we want a tourist to have a good experience. So it will be interesting to see how it pans out. It's something that's been coming along for it. There's a good amount of inventory of Airbnb in the Western Cape, Cape Town specifically. And there's also enough hotel rooms. So they seem to right now complement each other, and we embrace how do we work with them, and no alienation of new entrants. We welcome entrants, and obviously have to design strategies of how best to attract the tourist and make them have a good stay.
Now let's shift focus a little bit to how the sector is benefiting the local community and the local economy as well. We do know that it contributed about 1.5 million jobs in 2018. Give us a sense of how local communities are benefiting in terms of gainful employment and, of course, involvement in some of the key decisions that are made in the sector.
In the Western Cape, during the 2017-18 financial year, we've got about 300,000 direct, indirect, and jobs that creates, that's that spurs from that in our sector. So in our economic sector, or rather in the Western Cape's economy, the sector is recognized as a key economic driver. So from that 1.5 million, 300,000 is from the Western Cape. So in terms of your communities, if we talk about Airbnb, for instance, not all of them is the city centre based. They're out in suburbs, they're out in the region. So regional spread is important. Of course, we know that one tourism job creates a spin-off effect, because we know people have to eat, they have to sleep, their washing needs to be done. So there is that spin-off effect, and the main important driver would be to make sure tourism grows, so that we don't lose those jobs. They're very important to the economy and job creation in the Western Cape.
Now, of course, you're coming up to an election soon. What is the sector looking to the government to do? We know President Ramaphosa had mentioned that he plans to double the number of people directly employed in the sector, and a few other initiatives. How do you feel about these plans going forward, and what would you like to see from the government?
We welcome it. I think government, in terms of having a commitment from national government about the importance of the sector, is something, because that is what we do. It's a mandate from us. It also aligns to our own, there's two strategies. For instance, there's a local economic strategy that we've been working with in the last 4 years. This is actually the 5th year. Job creation and to grow visitors and to retain them, and it also aligns to a platform that South African Tourism is creating, which they call the 5-in-5-year strategy, where they also want to grow tourism with 5 more million and rivals to tourists in the province. So we are geared from a governmental angle to grow, to create, because we know of the value that it creates to our economy and the job creation. Very important for us. So although the strategies seem different, they work towards the same point.
Now, of course, we are in the Western Cape, so let's delve further into the region. It is the 3rd largest province in the country. It also has played a huge role in overall growth, not just in South Africa's tourism sector, but in other key sectors such as agriculture. Now, in 2018 and 2019, the region secured almost 5 billion rand in trade deals. And let's discuss this further with the region's Minister of Economic Opportunities, Beverly Schaefer. She now joins us on the set. Great to have you with us tonight. Now let's start off with the key drivers of growth in the region, and certainly the potential sectors of opportunity going forward. Give us a sense of what these are.
Okay, so in 2014, the government took a brand new approach, for the first time in South Africa's history, and really took a strategic focus to the economy. What we did was we ascertained which of the sectors of the economy produced not only the highest GDP growth over a period of 5 years, but also grew the most amount of jobs. And those 3 sectors that came out was tourism and oil and gas sector, because we've got the industrial development zone up on the west coast, and then agri-processing, which is linked to agriculture.
Now, what's your strategy to improve these sectors and certainly get the investment needed to get them going?
So first of all, we really stimulated those sectors. We knew that tourism, for example, was a low entry into unskilled job opportunities, which is a very important part for us. So we focused on those. We actually helped to stimulate the economy in that space. We spent money in that space, and we've today have created more jobs than any other province in South Africa.
And my next question was, how do you plan to reduce unemployment in the region and ensure that the youth here are participating and contributing to that growth?
Well, we certainly can't underestimate that even though we've created jobs, our youth unemployment and our unemployment numbers in South Africa are still very dismal. So how do we really put job creation on steroids? And this requires a new approach. And we are, for the next 5 years as a government, are going to be focusing on demand-led economic growth. We're finding that as a result of policy uncertainty and of a lot of challenges that South Africa finds itself in, including a very stagnant economic trajectory, that we're going to have to stimulate business to actually employ more people. That's linked with skill development. We find that businesses are complaining that they just don't have the right skilled people to actually match where we're going, and obviously in preparation for the new economy in the 4th Industrial Revolution.
And certainly, of course, the elections are upcoming in a week's time, actually. How do you think that's going to impact some of these targets that and goals that you've put in place?
Well, we certainly put the hard yards into aiming to retain the Western Cape. So as a Democratic Alliance, we are certain that we will retain the Western Cape to continue the next 5 years of business. We would be absolutely mortified if we lose the province, because our plans have worked. Our recipe has worked so far. We know what it takes. We have a competent government. We have a transparent government, and we certainly are able to produce based on our 9 years of growth.
Now, very quickly, do you feel confident that you will continue on after these elections?
I think if I can say that we've done the hard work, in terms of that, I feel confident. But at the end of the day, you never know what happens on election day. We certainly can't be complacent. We have to do the work that's required in order to win the hearts of the voters.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your insights. Of course, that was Beverly Schaefer. She is the Minister of Economic Development here in the Western Cape. Now, of course, we have to leave it there, but tomorrow we will be digging deeper into the land question in South Africa and how the ongoing debate on land expropriation without compensation affects agriculture in the Western Cape. And of course, we'll take you on a tour of the famous vineyards in Cape Town. Do stay tuned.
Ocho Koronko there, of course, in Cape Town, South Africa. Now, let's come back to East Africa. In about 12 hours' time on Friday, East Africa's most profitable company will be announcing its full year results for the 2018-2019 fiscal year. It's going to be quite the numbers fest, let me tell you. Now, with the agreement to merge between its next two largest rivals, Airtel and Telkom Kenya, Kenya's mobile market is effectively on its way to becoming a duopoly. So let's look at a snapshot of the last set of half-year numbers for the period ending in September. Revenue was just over $1.2 billion, up 7% year on year. Operating profits also 5% higher. Net earnings also were nearly 7% higher, at around $307 million. Some analysts, however, expecting a slightly weaker second half in Safaricom's fiscal year. Now, to put this into context, Safaricom's share price is up by about 5.3% today, but a little lower, around 29.55 US cents. In the year to end April, the company's share prices are up by over 26%, and investors clearly like this company enough to shrug off news of the impending exit of the current CEO, Bob Collymore. Now, why does that matter? Well, he was appointed as CEO back in 2010, and since then, the company's share prices has risen by over 500%. It's a fairly strong track record. So then, what should you expect early on the 3rd of May from Safaricom, not just as far as results are concerned, but also in terms of forward-looking risks? Earlier on, I spoke to Tracy Kivunyo, Senior Equity Research Analyst with Telima. I started by asking her where Safaricom should deploy its cash holdings of over $300 million.
The investments they've made by themselves have done much better than we've seen with the partnerships. But the partnerships also aid them in one key thing, stickiness. We have to remember that still the telco side of the business is the highest generating in terms of margins. So it's also part of their strategy to ensure that they protect that end so that they can even be even more aggressive on the mobile money side. So it works in both ways.
Speaking of the price stickiness issue, one of the things that we did see in the last 12 months or so was a wave of taxes being imposed on data and, of course, on mobile money services as well. 10% duty charge 2013, that went up to 12% sometime last year. The data side also had extra taxes imposed on it. But what's the pain point for consumers? At what point do we see taxes being raised so high that you actually start seeing a dip in usage?
Well, right now it's starting to become a concern because the more the customers use M-Pesa, the more price sensitive they become. So every increment in taxation, which is being passed through to the customer, you might see transactions start to slow down. Granted, the 2% increase did not really do much for the transaction space because Safaricom found a way to pass through most of that tax increase to the higher value transactions, while we are estimating the average value of transactions at around 2,500 shillings. So we haven't actually seen an impact. But of course, as the magnitude of the taxes increase, they may not be able to strategically increase the prices per se, and then would be very concerned about usage.
Are you expecting a price hike with the current budget?
Yes. The government is obviously very very keen to raise more revenue. There has been discussion on increasing the corporate tax rate, but also mobile money is still one of the least taxed sources of revenue in Kenya, so it's still under risk in my view.
All right, so in that sense, because you had a price target of about 27.42 and a hold recommendation in the stock, and you know, even before today, just blew right past that. We're at about 29.30 as we speak at this point in time. What's your investment case? What's your outlook for Safaricom, at least towards the end of the year?
I think that you might actually see a lot of activity on the stock because the performance is actually still the strongest, even though it's not strongest for Safaricom, it is the strongest of the NSE companies that we're looking at. But for me, I'm still putting my head around M-Pesa activation because now we're moving towards business related transfers, and activation of merchants is not as simple as it was to onboard the P2P transfer side. So because of that trade-off and withdrawals coming off, you're not seeing as strong a growth in M-Pesa as we did in the past. So for that reason, I'm maintaining a conservative stance as I wait to see more aggression on the activation side.
Assuming from a purely population standpoint, assuming you've hit peak growth, are those margins that we're seeing being built into mobile money services, are those margins sustainable?
They are, because what's happening is that there's increased velocity on the platform. So customers are not necessarily withdrawing the money, but they're using it for more case uses. So instead of putting in money and then cashing it out, they'll go to the supermarket, pay with M-Pesa, or they'll pay their electricity bill with M-Pesa. There are more use cases for M-Pesa. And when that happens, agency commissions are not paid out. And that's why you're seeing that margin expanding, because there's more money circulating in the system for them. So the way I see it, as long as they continue with that velocity, the agents' commissions will come down, and airtime commissions also come down as customers top up via M-Pesa instead of going to get scratch cards. So I actually think there's quite a lot of room for potential for the margin increment in M-Pesa.
One of the arguments that has been made over and over again is that the cost of mobile money, just moving cash from A to B or paying merchants, it's relatively speaking, relatively high. And those really haven't been revised that much, at least not in the last 5 years or so. And we have seen regulatory threats coming Safaricom's way. There's been a threat to break up the company. There's been a threat to impose price controls of some sort, given the dominance argument. How big a risk is that?
For now, I wouldn't say it's that big of a risk, because we have to also remember that M-Pesa is very integrated as a part of the economy. So the government would not be very keen to reduce prices at a time that it's trying to generate maximum revenue. So for now, it would be more of a priority to have regulations considering the competitiveness of the platform.
All right, then, time for a short break. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. We'll take a look at the outcomes of the recently ended trade talks between China and the US. And we'll also dive into the world of learning how to fly these little devices when we come back.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
For look at some economic data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Penina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed, and this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives.
From Nairobi City Center.
News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference. How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the program. Now, we've been getting reports that an announcement of a possible trade deal between the US and China could come as soon as next week. The two countries have pushed to resolve a trade dispute that led to a series of tariffs being imposed by both parties, and it sparked concerns worldwide of spiraling economic damage. The two parties have been holding talks for the last 4 months, and each time they end those talks and paint a picture of positive progress. Let's get the latest on these talks from Leah Duncan. She's live in New York with the latest on this. So the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, he described the last set of talks as being productive, but both sides have been going back and forth on this for months now. Why don't we have a deal on the table yet?
Well, that's certainly a question on many people's minds. We know that both sides have cited progress on issues including intellectual property and forced technology transfer, but U.S. officials have said that an enforcement mechanism for a deal and timelines for lifting tariffs are sticking points. Agreeing to a way to enforce a deal is one thing, but ensuring that it is executed under the agreed terms adds another complicated layer. Earlier this week, media outlet Politico reported that the U.S. And China are nearing a deal, and that would actually roll back a portion of the $250 billion in U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods. It said that the sides had reached an understanding on how to enforce the agreement, but details needed to still be worked out. Politico also reported that a deal would involve immediate removal of 10% tariffs on a portion of $200 billion in Chinese goods affected by that duty, with a phased removal of tariffs on remaining goods. Now, according to Reuters reporting, it appears that tariffs may just be the last thing on the list to get resolved. Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin recently told the New York Times that talks were entering a critical point and were getting into the final laps. But of course, there is no deal until we have a deal.
Indeed. So over the last 4 months of talks, the tone coming out of Washington has been mostly optimistic. But yesterday, the White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, he reiterated that the country could walk away from these talks. So let's take that to its logical conclusion. Assuming it did happen, what kind of economic damage would it cause on the US side?
Well, the most immediate impact coming to mind here would likely be seen in the stock market. Part of the reason that we've seen stocks trading at record highs in the United States, with gains for the S&P 500 at 17% so far this year, the Dow 13%, the Nasdaq Composite that up 20% so far this year, has been because there is this expectation that we would see a trade deal between the United States and China. So if there's no deal, we would likely see some sort of negative reaction in markets, and there's a chance that tariffs could increase. We know that the president called off raising tariffs earlier this year because negotiations were progressing, and that, of course, would cause a lot of pain for many companies. I spoke to a Reuters financial markets editor, and he says the thinking here is if President Trump just leaves the existing 10% tariffs in place on an open-ended basis, it is not too big a hit because adjustments have already been made for those since they've been in place for about a year now. If, however, he goes to 25% in retaliation for not getting a deal, it becomes a different story, and the impact would vary depending on what China then responds with. Now, just this week, I want to point out that we heard from one of the most valuable companies in the world, iPhone maker Apple. It reported its quarterly earnings, and its CEO Tim Cook talked about China and the overall tone around the trade negotiations between the U.S. and that country. He said that the relationship appeared to be better, and that actually helped their business.
Right, I'm glad you actually brought up Apple, because 24 hours ago, the FT, the Financial Times, reported the US side apparently has dropped a demand that China ends alleged cases of cyber theft. And this really has been a part of the central demand from the White House. So why change this focus at this late stage in the talks?
Yeah, we did see that report out of the FT. So far, Reuters has not been able to verify that report, but this is a difficult one. It's tricky here because China has insisted that the cyber theft allegations are baseless. But it is entirely possible that the U.S. could be taking this off the table in exchange for something else, just in an attempt to really move these talks along. So it seems like this could very well be what's taking place here.
Indeed. One last question for you, Leah. So assuming a deal is arrived at between these two sides, what kind of enforcement options is the White House exploring?
Well, Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin has talked about the two sides agreeing to establishing new enforcement offices to police any deal, which is being viewed as crucial. Of course, China would likely have a department, and the U.S. will have some sort of structure in place to support the agreement. The thinking is to work out any complaints that might come up and to make sure that each side is holding up their end of the bargain. Chinese officials have said that it must work two ways, and restraints can't only be placed on China. There's also the issue of whether the enforcement structure would allow the U.S. a unilateral right to reimpose tariffs without retaliation if China fails to follow through on its commitments. People familiar with the talks has said that U.S. negotiators are seeking that right, but that China is reluctant to agree to such a concession. But according to written replies to questions on the Senate Finance Committee's website on Wednesday, Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, he said, quote, to the extent that issues cannot be resolved at the vice premier level, then the United States would have the right to act unilaterally to enforce this. This mechanism I described did not exist in past dialogues. Now, as we know, Chinese Vice Premier Liu He is expected to travel to Washington for more talks starting on May 8th. And the White House so far has said that the subjects of next week's talks will cover, trade issues, including intellectual property, forced technology transfer, non-tariff barriers, agriculture, services, purchases, as well as enforcement. But by all intents and purposes here, it certainly seems that we could very well be in the final rounds of these talks.
Indeed. Let's see how they all do play out. Leah Duncan in New York. Thank you very much. Now, drone services are quickly expanding into a whole new range of areas, professional photography, agriculture, security, you name it. The rapid development of unmanned aerial vehicle tech has created an entirely new job. Drone pilots. It's an occupation that now is officially recognized as a profession in China. CGTN's Chen Tong has been talking to some professional drone pilots to find out how their new jobs are taking off.
Tu Jiayun is one of our cameramen at Shanghai Television. And just 2 years ago, he was asked by his boss to learn new shooting technique, aerial photography. And that meant he had to learn how to fly a drone.
It was simple at first, but it got harder when we had to turn off the GPS during training.
At our Shanghai media group, 15% of the cameramen have been trained to shoot aerial pictures. But there are plenty of other professional photographers in town who make their living with drones. One of them is Liu Supei, one of China's first aerial photographers, who shoots documentaries for both domestic and foreign media. He now holds 2 professional licenses and says the demand for aerial photography has seen a major jump in last few years. He's lost track of how many orders he receives a year, but says he hardly ever gets a holiday off. And for someone at his skill level, it pays quite well.
就在上海区域的话，一般就是
In Shanghai, the pay is 8,000 yuan a day. Sometimes if it's a long shoot, like for documentaries, I wind up getting paid by the month.
给你发，就是月薪给你发。
Video clips from drones may make movies look more fascinating, but there are so many other areas that have large demand for drones.
The new jobs are in agriculture, surveillance and emergency rescue, and they're so important that drone pilots have just been confirmed as a recognized profession by the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security. Aerial photography is one of the most highly paid skills for drone pilots, and even those with less flight training can find work. Spraying farm pesticides, for example, or inspecting countryside areas which may be difficult to reach from the ground. In 2014, the number of drone pilots holding professional licenses from the Civil Aviation Administration was less than 2,000. But it's 10 times that now. Currently, institutions and companies hiring drone services are not required to ensure their pilots are licensed. But Chen Guangwen, who trains drone pilots for a living, says the increasing use of drones means the market has to become more regulated.
When
we started to offer training in 2014, many people thought it wasn't necessary to offer training, but then there were some accidents, so now there are regulations from the Civil Aviation Administration. If the industry is to develop in a healthy manner, pilots should be professionally licensed. If they get a license, it's easier to get flying approval from the authorities and insurance coverage as well. The industry is becoming more regulated.
A report from Tianzhan.com shows that the value of China's drone service market will reach over $2 billion in 2020, an annual increase of over 15%. It's really taking off.
All right, then let's make a quick run through some commodity prices here for you. Brent crude back barely above $70 a barrel at about 15:33 GMT today. It's falling to levels that we've not seen really in about a month. In part, that's because Russian oil output is going up. US stockpiles also have risen, and all of those are combined to offset concerns about a supply shortage, especially now that exemptions for Iranian oil imports have pretty much ended. Shell also facing more legal trouble, this time in the Netherlands. Courts have decided they do have jurisdiction to hear a damages suit brought against the oil major by widows of activists executed in Nigeria in 1995. Royal Dutch Shell, of course, denies any liability. Here's what's coming up next. We'll introduce you to a Rwandese entrepreneur who makes purely organic cosmetics. And we'll also take you into the latest terminal to be built at the Algiers International Airport.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. Let's head over to Rwanda now, where the cosmetics industry is showing quite a bit of promise. So much so that a young citizen over there has decided to take a proverbial leap of faith and set up a cosmetic brand that describes itself as being purely organic. Here's CGTN's Terry Wangari with more.
Sefas Nshimyumuremi started with just $10 when he launched a new natural cosmetics line called Uburanga, or beauty in English. It's grown into a business worth $40,000. The young Rwandese has always had big dreams, but as a science teacher in rural Rwanda, he was struggling to make ends meet. With just $10 in his pocket, he decided to use his knowledge to open a business.
We make sure that the product which we are producing
is for Africa especially, and they are natural. The other product they have chemicals, some chemicals, and these chemicals can destroy, for example, the skin.
Many of the plants, including aloe vera, are grown in Nshimyumuremi's own garden. They are dried, crushed and mixed with oil and water to make soap, antibacterial gels and shampoos. With one bar of soap selling for 50 cents and a bottle of lotion at $1, the beauty range is an affordable alternative.
I started using Uburanga products because I suffered from terrible acne and it used to make me feel uncomfortable. In 2012, Cephas gave me a soap to use as a trial and everybody used to laugh because the soap was black and had a strange shape, but it cleared the spots on my face. After that, I started using the lotion from his range of products, which I also used on my daughter who had white patches on her scalp. I used the Uburanga castor oil to treat the white patches.
Since starting in 2012, Uburanga has grown into a business with 20 employees and around 5,000 distributors across Rwanda. The company exports its products to the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Tanzania and Zimbabwe. Terry Wangare, CGTN.
On to aviation now. A new terminal built by the China State Construction Engineering Corporation is up and running. And so in North Africa, it's a $67 million terminal at the Algiers International Airport. First flight to Paris, served by the national carrier, Air Algeria, took off earlier this week.
The new terminal has 120 check-in counters, 12 luggage racks, 54 lifts and 37 escalators, among other features. The structure also includes 20 aircraft contact points, as well as dozens of commercial and service areas. The cost of this project is estimated at more than $67 million.
The Chinese company CSCEC got the market of the new terminal once we launched the idea of the project. I can tell you one thing is that the CSCEC company has improved a lot since finishing the works of T1. Now it can compete with any international company in this field. CSCEC's work quality is high. They have qualified engineers and performant workers who respect deadlines.
The new airport infrastructure has been designed to manage the ever-growing number of passengers from the capital.
Compared to other terminals, it's like major airports in Europe. It's not bad, it's more spacious, more functional and more interesting than the two existing terminals. We are on the right path.
It looks good as the terminal in France. I'm French and I find it very good. There's nothing to say than magnificent.
In addition, it allows airlines to create their Africa-Europe and Africa-Asia hubs, as well as access to the transit market. Hlonela Lupuana, CGTN.
Right then, a quick run through the currencies here for you. So as far as currencies are concerned, some clearer budget data did come out of Kenya today. The country's targeting a fiscal deficit of 5.6% of GDP in the 2019-2020 fiscal year. Now that's compared, of course, to the target this year of 6.1%. But all in, that means the country's going to come to market, borrow about $3.2 billion from foreign markets and about $2.8 billion in the domestic side. But Kenya, remember, has blown through deficit targets before. Something equivalent to a Thanos snap, frankly. So one reaction to these numbers is, are they really credible? We'll let the markets and time decide that. That's where we wrap up this edition of Global Business Africa. Thank you very much for your time in the last hour. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in that time. Several ways of getting your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.